A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, here's a question that some need to perhaps think carefully about. It certainly needs our attention. Are we drunk on freedom? Well, our special guest today argues that our interpretation of what freedom means has been a huge distraction from more important things. So today, an opportunity to turn our attention to our national obsession with freedom. Author Max Jeganathan says, while we were busy pursuing personal liberties, freedom has crept out of our constitutions and legal systems and into our eating, our shopping, and live streaming habits. One downside is that our pursuit of personal freedoms has made us somehow more anxious, more grumpy, and even more divided than ever. Max Jeganathan's new book is called The Freedom Trap, and he's been exploring ways to free ourselves from that trap. Max is a senior research fellow at the Centre for Public Christianity, and he's joining us. Max, a special welcome along to 2020.
Thanks so much, Neil. Thanks for having me on. It's great to be with you.
Hey, Max, are we really drunk on freedom? What are your thoughts here?
Well, obviously that's a pretty provocative line that I used, and I think there is a really strong case to be made that we are. Obviously, it's a big broad brush, and different people are in very different stages and phases with how they understand freedom and how they live their lives. So I don't by any means want to be, drawing a blanket judgment over all of modern society, but I think there's a really strong case to be made, Neil, that we've taken this good, precious, positive old ideal of freedom, and we have collectively twisted it and reshaped it and morphed it, if you like, into something that is far less healthy and far less positive for us in our individual everyday lives and for us collectively as a society. And so your summary of my book and my contentions are absolutely spot on. My sense is that while freedom pretty manifestly started as a very good thing, in the political and legal realm, the freedom from illegitimate and unfair constraints, so the freedoms of thought and speech and religion and the freedom of association and all of these basic freedoms, which have thankfully been baked into constitutions and legal systems all over the world, not all of them, admittedly, but a growing amount of them, and that's a good thing. In more recent times, perhaps since the beginning of the Industrial Revolutions, there has been a bit of a freedom creep, if you like, where we now find that freedom is much more about what I can do with my time and my resources for me to be able to get what I want, live stream what I want, buy what I want. And that has made us, in broader terms, more psychologically distressed, more anxious, less satisfied, more divided, more polarized, and grumpier.
So when we think of our individual freedoms, we're making a lot of those, and that's at the expense of the sort of freedoms that come when we show a little bit of personal responsibility and constraint, because then that might contribute to a more community-wide freedom. Is this individualism, this is something that seems to be a little bit of a contagion in Australia? Is this where we maybe need to have a focus on individuals? Because we could talk about corporate levels, but back to this individual level for a moment. Is this an area we need to focus on, do you think?
Yeah, I think you certainly hit on a very important part of the story there, Neil. The idea of individualism is obviously not a new one, and mountains of books and PhD theses have been written about that. What my book tries to do at a more accessible, popular level is to just take a small step back and try to diagnose something of what's caused this individualism and what's driving it. And I think how we understand freedom is central to that. And my contention is, and I explore this, phase it out in the book, fill it out in the book a bit more, is that freedom has come to mean for many people something very different, and that thing is autonomy. And while freedom in its classical sense is really about the absence of constraints from government and illegitimate restrictions, autonomy is a very different word. It's actually made up of a couple of much more dangerous, in my view, STEM words, auto meaning self and nomos meaning law. So while freedom traditionally and classically it should and was about the freedom from constraints. Autonomy is really this idea that each individual is a law unto themselves. Each of us, we are a law unto ourselves, free of conditions, free of other people, free of tradition, free of ethics and ideals and any kind of objective reference points or moral reference points or relational reference points outside of us. And I think that's a very dangerous thing, because pretty quickly what you get then, and we're seeing far too many glimpses of it out there in our news headlines, in our social media sphere and so forth, is you get 8 billion people walking around out there, each of them the king or queen of their own little universe, thinking that they are the most important thing. And you mentioned it correctly in the preface to your question, and my book touches on it, that a big reality of all freedom, regardless of how much personal freedom each of us has, is that at some point that freedom will necessarily be at risk of rubbing up against the freedoms of other people. You know, I might say that I want to be free to drive my car as fast as I can, but there are other people that probably want to be free to arrive at their destination safely. And if we both try and exert those competing freedoms absolutely, then they're going to clash into each other. So there's a lot in there, I know, but it begins, I think, with mistaking freedom for autonomy.
I like to just boil it down to really simple things to understand. When I think of the sorts of freedoms and the autonomy that you're talking about, I know we're free to drive on the roads, but every now and then I'll see a speed sign, and I know that if I speed excessively, then everybody else's life is at risk. So I don't know whether that's a good illustration here, but when you start to think of the constraints that we have that protect others, applying those then into the sorts of other issues that we're facing, issues around sexual freedom, which are causing all sorts of, I think, consternation right now. Does simple ways of thinking about constraining or holding back some of our freedoms have this same effect across all these other different and deeper dimensions of our lives, do you think?
Yeah, there's an interesting analogy that, you know, the famous children's author and professor of literature, C.S. Lewis, used in talking about freedom. And he gives this analogy of a goldfish sitting in a bowl of water, sitting on a table. And he makes the point that on any modern technical definition of freedom, that goldfish is constrained. It's constrained by the water, it's constrained by the tank, it's constrained by its surroundings. And so Lewis says to properly liberate that fish in, you know, common modern vernacular on freedom, you would have to pick it up by its tail and drop it on the table next to the bowl. And then it would be much more free in a technical sense. It would be more purely free. But then Lewis asks, but would it be truly free? And more importantly, would it be flourishing? And what this illustration kind of teases out is a pretty simple but a deeply profound truth, which is that true freedom, at least insofar as it's related to flourishing, is not really about the absence of constraints, which might be what autonomy is about. But true freedom is actually about getting the right kinds of conditions around you. And that applies, I think, whether you're a goldfish or a person, in that we actually need to work out what the conditions are through which we can optimize for our fulfillment, our flourishing and well-being, and probably equally importantly, for the fulfillment and flourishing and well-being of the people around us. And so where my book kind of gets to is that through a biblical and a Christian vision of freedom, you see these things playing out in a more resonant, relevant and beautiful way.
So when we're applying these sorts of things to marriage and relationships and family and even the way we function within society, where we've got these autonomous freedoms that we want, and that's affecting the way we perhaps have traditionally viewed things that have held a society together. We look like we're losing some of those. How do you apply these to some of these norms that we might think of have their foundations in a biblical context, like marriage and family and sexuality, those sorts of things? Any thoughts here? This is getting into some deep end stuff here, but this is where the rubber hits the road, isn't it?
Well, I think there's deeper first principles at play here when we look at things like relationality and freedom, where I think we should actually start the conversation. I think far too often, certainly politically and in the public square, we often start the conversation at the policy level or at the political level, which which is not in and of itself problematic, but it's always incomplete. And so my book actually goes further upstream and talks about take a fundamental or a first principle like love, for example, and it does explore this in one of the chapters in the book. An important aspect of love and relationship is constraining ourselves and giving of ourselves for the other. And so while we might live in a world where we are told to get what we can and take what we can and get away with whatever we can, true relationship and love in its purest form, and therefore freedom in its healthiest form, is really got to include some aspect of giving something of ourselves to the other. And we see this in the Bible, and I do go into this in the book, in Paul's world famous treatise on love in 1 Corinthians, where he talks about all the usual conventional things about love, which we hear read out at all of the weddings out there, that love is patient, love is kind, etc., etc. But the most powerful and gritty part of that is actually towards the back end, where Paul says love rejects evil, it rejoices in good, it always preserves, it always protects. And so straight away we have this new aspect of love that we rarely see in our movies, in our music, in our literature, where love is more often than not portrayed as something relating to affection and desire and these sorts of things. When you look at what Paul is saying and you look at the Christian vision of love, love begins to become about sacrifice, giving of yourself. And that's a complete inversion and turning of its head of what a lot of kind of modern vernacular is around love. So when you take something like freedom and think about it in the context of relationality, as you've correctly raised, we have to look at the reality that, once again, autonomy doesn't wash, and freedom has to be more outward facing, and it has to have something beyond itself to be pointed at. And the Christian vision of what that is necessarily includes, relationship and love and giving of oneself. And so it's no coincidence then. In fact, it's only fitting and in fact necessary that the whole thing would be anchored in this idea of a God who actually stepped into the world and gave of himself. So that's just one example of how true freedom plays out. Freedom needs to be about other people, not just me.
Hey, Max, if we're drunk on freedom, this autonomy, maybe we're going to look for the sort of catchy slogans that might fuel our own autonomy, and you might even call that a selfishness as well, I guess. Love is love. We'll have heard that time and time again over this last decade. That's been a challenging thing where the concept of love, as you've described it, biblical love, and that's self-sacrifice, that's escaped us because we've been able to listen to these catchy slogans and take us completely in a different direction. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think a big trend that we've seen, and again, there's plenty that's been written about this, is that I think when there's instability out there, as there has been in many ways, for the last, since the communications revolution and the most recent rounds of the industrial revolution that has brought forward, the internet and the digitalization of so much of life and so forth, things have really accelerated in every respect. We're taking in far more in terms of input and images and messages from out there. And a part of that, and that's obviously had many positives, many people have been lifted out of poverty. We have greater technological capabilities, economic productivity and efficiency, and all of these things have been examples of the benefits of all of that. One negative aspect of it is, what we were talking about just earlier, which is this individualism idea. And what happens with that is that people get turned in on themselves and are much more focused on short-term desires, short-term self-interest, or at least their perceptions of their own short-term desires and self-interest. And this happens to everyone, regardless of what we believe. It happens to Christians, it happens to non-Christians, it happens to atheists, it happens to everyone. It's just a very sad but universal human instinct that when we are left without objective reference points outside of ourselves, we tend to drift into self-interest and that inversion. When St. Augustine was trying to make sense of this complicated Christian doctrine of sin, he came up with a really powerful phrase, I think, where he said, well, it's pretty much just men and women curved in on themselves. And you certainly see that a lot. And a big part of my book kind of explores this idea that if we don't have something greater than ourselves to point our freedom at, it really will just becomes something that we use to self-serve, if you like. And I think that's hugely problematic. And that's why, we all need, regardless of our beliefs, something beyond ourselves and something purer and more beautiful and unchanging than ourselves at which to point our freedom. And the Christian message, in my view, offers that to people and offers audacious things like sacrifice as a pathway for that to be possible.
A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation. Our special guest is Max Jeganathan. His new book is called The Freedom Trap. We're talking about freedom and asking, are we drunk on freedom? Max, let me just, I'll let you know, I've got a text here from a listener. A listener says, hi Neil, listening to your conversation about are we drunk on freedom? Whilst I understand what you and your guest are talking about, however, this past few years would suggest that Australians are drunk on lack of freedom. I'll argue that there are increasing lack of freedoms in this country and our constitution and human rights are being ignored. God does not create us with the intent of not being free. It's not of God. During the so-called pandemic, I, along with countless others, were mandated out of our professions because we refused a COVID jab. Australia also experienced medical apartheid, and some Christian churches denied people entry during COVID. How, may I ask, is that freedom? How is denying a man or a woman the ability to work and provide for their families freedom? How do we respond to something like that and those thoughts there? Max, any thoughts for that listener?
Yeah, well, thank you to that listener for listening and for engaging and for your comment and your question. I think what's important to remember is that I talked briefly earlier, and I talked very briefly early in my book about political and legal and civic freedoms and how that's how, freedom classically has come about and been understood historically for humankind. And the nature of government is such that, the entire project of government is really about drawing lines around freedom. So all governments necessarily do that. The only way to have unlimited and ultimate freedom is to have no government at all. That really would be anarchy. And so we've got this system of government that has been developed. The Bible, of course, doesn't set down a particular system of government. It's silent on that. But I think you can make a pretty strong case that democratic government, along with free markets, is consistent with biblical principles of intrinsic human dignity and all of the freedoms that the listener mentioned. Because of that, because we do have this, and we have this need for this thing called government, there's never going to be ultimate freedom. There are always going to be incursions on freedom. And, taxes are a good example of that. Speed limits are a good example of that. Seatbelt laws are a good example of that. Laws against murder are another example of that. And so when governments do what governments do, which is curtail freedom in a way that they perceive to be good for the people, there are always going to be some of us, sometimes many of us, that disagree with how that works. Now, and I fully respect the views of the listener to put it into place. And they've used a lot of examples in recent times. I actually wasn't living in Australia through COVID. I experienced that while living in another country. But I know that there are enormously divergent opinions on how that was handled by various state governments and the federal governments and so forth. And I totally understand that. But I think at a broader and higher level, it's important to remember that there are always going to be people that disagree with what governments do. And that's good and proper. And at the more fundamental level, I think what's important is that we have the freedom to disagree, the freedom to debate, the freedom to throw out and elect in governments and leaders when we deem them to have curtailed our freedoms unnecessarily. And democracy at its best does work like that. Now, that's all at the kind of higher political level. Where my book actually goes is it says, look, those arguments and discussions about freedom at a political level are going to be there, but how do we perceive freedom in our everyday lives? How is this relevant to you and me in our everyday decision-making? There are always going to be elements of political freedom that we have, elements of political freedom that we want, things that governments are doing that we don't like. But how is freedom playing out in your life, in your decisions, in how you decide where you live, where you work, when you retire, where your kids go to school, what you're live streaming, what you're listening to, and so forth.
We'll get to some of those. Just stay with this freedom and government for a few moments, because interestingly, freedom of political communication, and we might pride ourselves on the ability of our candidates in election to be able to have a freedom to be able to talk about whatever issue that they might like. And there's some of those sorts of things being impinged upon right now. But the freedom to disagree with the government, that's a powerful one. But when you've got social media in the mix and it short circuits the usual ways that our representatives might be involved in a debate, it means that everybody has almost the same level of say, because we're all building a little empire. That doesn't really help, does it, when you're talking about freedoms?
It certainly makes it far more complicated and far more difficult, I think, because social media, for all of its benefits, and I am firmly of the view that there are plenty of benefits, has a lot of shortcomings and a lot of problems too. And one of them is that it takes away this really important layer that we used to have for all of human history, basically, until social media came along, which is credibility in the public square, where there were editorial boards and truth-checking and fact-checking, and there were certain, hoops and barriers that one had to clear. Now, it's never been pure and perfect, and there have been plenty of illegitimate examples of public squares gone wrong that were restricted, but I totally agree that a big part of the problem now with making decisions about how we exercise our freedoms and even how we exercise our political freedoms and political free speech and so forth does have this problem that anyone and everyone is potentially a worldwide influencer. All you need is a smartphone and a decent internet connection, and then you're away. And I think what that means for us as individuals is we have to be very careful. We have to be agile and responsive. We have to, go out of our way to take in views that we agree with and disagree with, and to verify those views to the degree that, they are consequential to us. And certainly in an election campaign, that's just one of those seasons where we all have to be on our game and not just get wrapped up and wound up in this world of kind of confirmation bias and in the digital silos that the algorithms try to herd us into.
Let's take a call. Helen is in Cairns in North Queensland. Hi, Helen. Welcome along.
Hi, how are you?
Very good, Helen. What are your thoughts?
Well, I know why our guest speaks about the freedom trap, but, from a scriptural point of view, which a lot of people, might not understand because not a lot of people read the Bible anymore, it's licentiousness, and our there's a difference between freedom and license, and our nation tends to be drunk on licentiousness. And it says in the Bible they promised them freedom when they themselves are slaves of sin. And it's only the truth, who is Jesus, that makes us free. So we need godly leaders. If we don't have godly leaders, well, then they don't even know what freedom is. And so how can they lead us into freedom?
Well, what a great question. Max, what are your thoughts here for Helen in Cairns?
Helen, thank you so much for calling in and for engaging. I couldn't agree with you more about licentiousness. I think that touches on the exact point that, Neil, that you and I were discussing earlier about autonomy. Autonomy is from the same family as licentiousness, and that's certainly the biblical principle that I was drawing on, that I had in mind when I explored that in my book and when I made that comment. I think that idea that, we can do whatever we like, whenever we like, however we like, is very clearly dealt with in the negative throughout the Bible, but it's also been pretty clearly proven to be problematic when individuals and societies try to base any kind of moral horizon on such a licentious attitude where everyone should just be able to do whatever they want, however they want. And so Helen's point, Helen, your point is really, really important, not just in an election campaign, but I think it's just broadly important for the project that we are all in, which is that of building a society together for the greater benefit of all of us. Licentiousness and autonomy, these sorts of words are pretty unhelpful and at their worst pretty dangerous. We need, once again, something beyond ourselves at which to point our freedom, that goes beyond our self-interest, that goes beyond short-term feelings, and that goes to a broader, common and greater good. And Helen, you correctly, make the point that the Bible has great moral resources to help us with this as a broader society, both for those of us who are Christian and those who are not as well. And one of those things is this idea, and it's another thing that's been lost, this idea of a shared future and a common good. That idea of a common good is a pretty, old classical idea, not just in biblical theology and philosophy, but in all kinds of other ancient philosophies too. But it's something that has really dropped out of the system in more recent times, where we're in more of a post-truth space, where the messaging out there in the cultural waters in which we're all swimming is really about you doing you and your best self, and you can decide what's right and wrong for yourself. It takes away objective reference points. It takes away the idea of a common good, and it all feeds into this kind of autonomous, licentious instinct, which sadly is deep down on every human heart. We all need rescue from it, and we all need a pathway out of it.
Wonderful stuff. Helen, anything further to add?
That's all right. It all boils back to only Jesus can help us. If we don't have revival, we're done for, basically.
In actual fact, that's an interesting point that you pick up on. And as you'll know, I have a lot of guests who, and it rolls off their tongue very easily, without revival, we're done for. I wonder if you've got a thought or two here, Max, because it's easy to say. And when we talk about the Bible being a moral resource, we've got people who would come to faith in revival, but it takes maturity to be able to mine those moral resources that might actually bring us the freedoms for the common good. Any thoughts here? Because it's a good point that Helen's making, but have you got anything to elaborate there?
Yeah, look, it is an important point. And I think that the problems that Helen and I both outlined with the human condition are pretty broadly understood out there, both inside and outside of the Christian church and the Christian family, and certainly the Christian belief system. And of course, there are people out there that have come up with different responses. So there are different ways of getting around this broken human condition, if you like. The reason I find the Christian response and the biblical response so compelling is that it's not about people lifting themselves up by their own bootstraps, their own moral bootstraps. And I think that touches on your last question, Neil, which is that how do we get to this place of virtue and common good and the shared future in a positive kind of moral and ethical frame? The Christian message stands out to me as something that's quite unique, because it's not about being good in our own strength. It actually begins with the understanding that we can't be good in our own strength, and we need help from outside of ourselves. And so, leading into Easter, there's no better time to revisit that and to remember that and to kind of communicate that and live that out. Now, I know you've got listeners, plenty of whom, like me, would call themselves Christian. And I hope you've got a few. I'm sure you've got a few that aren't, or might be in a place now where they're either exploring or struggling in their faith, or maybe outright rejection of the Christian message. And so for all of us, I think that's the important thing to remember, that we're not going to get out of this mess in our own strength and with our own convictions. We need help and rescue from outside of ourselves, and that's what the Easter story is really about.
Helen in Cairns, thank you so much for great insights. Our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. You can also send us a text, 0447 488 316, and you can find a little text button in the Vision app. Just go onto the Vision stream there, click on the Vision stream, and it'll say call or text. You can send us a text too. Hey, Max, let's talk about the traps that you are listing in your book. We're talking about your book. It's called The Freedom Trap, but you've got a number of traps, plural, in there. Give us a little outline of those, and we might pick up on some of those points because we haven't got time to talk about all of them, but hit us with the 4 traps.
Yeah, sure, Neil. Well, I identified 4. There are many more, I'm sure, but there are 4 that stick out to me as the probably most powerful and influential ones that affect all of us every day that we need to be aware of. I make the case and explore the evidence for the idea that we are trapped by choice, that we can be trapped by technology, that we can be trapped by measures of success, how society understands success, and we can be trapped by the consequences of our choices. And so just to open up a couple of those, the idea that we can actually be trapped by choice, so there can actually be too much choice. We can actually have decision fatigue or decision anxiety. And there's an old, reasonably well-known study that I cite where the social researchers studied how people select jam at the supermarket, how they buy jam. And what the findings were that the fewer varieties of jam you have available means that people are more likely to buy jam and that they take much less time in buying jam and that there's far less anxiousness and stress and anxiety in buying jam. Now, it's obviously a very simple and a pretty trivial thing to talk about jam. And then I'm sure there are other studies in other spheres that give us good examples of where more choice can actually be a good thing. But the broader first principle holds. More choice is not always better. And so when it comes to our live streaming options and our subscriptions or where we want to holiday or what we want to eat, sometimes we spend more time than it's worth spending on decisions that are not all that consequential. And, there's an interesting example that I heard once with President Barack Obama when he was president. He made the point that he only wore two colours of suits for his entire presidency. He just alternated between the two the whole 8 years. And when asked why, he said, look, I've got some pretty important decisions to make and some big ones. I don't want to waste my decision-making capacity on trivial things like choosing suits. So obviously, some choices are more important than others, but I think we could go a long way to improving our health and well-being and saving a ton of time if we just limited some of our choices. More choices not always better. So that's just one example of one of the trappings that's out there.
You know what? This is just a fabulous way of being able to talk about freedom and traps, whether it's the suit choice that you might have or buying jam at the supermarket. And as you say, if there's lots of choices, it's harder to actually choose. It's a little bit like, when you're flicking through all the TV channels and saying, we used to only have 4 channels, but now we've got 50 and there's still nothing on. Can't choose. So let me just ask you here, because this I think is really important. How do you think we minimise some of those choices and draw them into having a focus? I mean, if we're Christians and we've got a biblical mandate and we've got the mission of God or those sorts of things, how do we actually start to limit the things that we're being bombarded with so far as choices so that we can navigate a way forward and not waste our lives?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'd like to think I address some of that in the book. It begins with, it really comes back to C.S. Lewis's goldfish, We've got to get the right conditions and constraints around us. And so that can look like everything from just having a regimented time every day where we put our smartphones out of sight. We just put them away. We turn them off or we mute them. We take whatever steps we have to get off the screens. And so we don't have to worry about the choices and the influx of what app to open next or, what to scroll through next and so forth. We could, I think I used this example in the book, we could, cut down and minimize our wardrobe. One of the biggest wastes of time, I think, and misuses of freedom is wasted on deciding what we're going to wear every morning. And so you could rotate, you could trim down your wardrobe, cut it in quarters and rotate it, every week or every month. So you have less things to choose from. We could be more regimented and limit choice in how we eat. I know many families certainly do this. My family certainly does. You could have pizza Tuesdays and nacho Fridays and, steak and veggies Thursdays and so forth. And so that, again, limits the otherwise potentially quite stressful and anxious process of choosing what to buy at the supermarket or filling up the grocery basket. So there are little things that we can do to thoughtfully limit our choices. So we're optimizing the time and headspace we've got for the more important things, for our families, for our faith, for our relationships, for our work, for the things that really matter. So limiting choice is not easy, but we've got to get the right conditions, and that means we have to introduce some of these constraints ourselves. It comes down to self-discipline.
You know what? You're also delivering tremendous wisdom around parenting, because as parents, we know that our children are exposed perhaps to even more of the choices than we are exposed to. So this way that we might have a responsibility for our own family and within our own marriages to be able to try and limit things to the things that are important, getting priorities right is not so easy. So this comes down to every individual. We have to be able to measure priorities somehow to be able to make the right sort of choices. How do you describe that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It does come back to priorities, and it comes down to, I think, taking a step back and carefully reflecting on what our priorities should be, what they in fact are, where's the gap, and what concrete steps are we going to put in place to make sure we correct it to the degree that we're not actually prioritizing the things that should be the main thing. And so one of the kind of life hacks I set down in the book is, it seems quite simple, but it's something, I certainly don't do enough, and I don't know many people that do this enough, is just to slow down and pay attention. I think we just need to take some time. One of the biggest deficits at the moment is time. We're all very time poor, but somehow we have the same 24 hours in the day that they had 200 or 300 or 400 years ago, which means we're not time poor at all. We're just not spending our time correctly. We're not being thoughtful enough, and we're not being disciplined enough in how we structure and organize our time. So slowing down, paying attention, easing back on the amount of input that we're taking in, and actually thinking carefully, what are the most important things in my life? My faith, my family, my spouse, if I have one, my children, if I've got them, and then in that order, moving down, my vocation, what I'm called to do, my work. How are those priorities being served? Then apps on your phone, take a look at the number of screens you've got in your life, take a look at what's going in and out of your bank account. And this will obviously look different for different people, which is why I don't want to be too prescriptive. But if we start with slowing down, paying attention, and limiting our choices where that can be done, I think that's a pretty good start.
We can't ignore the fact that we're in an election campaign season right now. And I know some might say, well, let's not politicise a conversation about freedoms, although this is actually a political conversation because our freedoms, some will say, are dramatically at risk. Some of the freedoms that we could have taken away from us. And I didn't mention it in the introduction at all, but you've worked as a lawyer, you've worked as a policy advisor in Canberra. Max, we've got an election coming up. Just trying to ascertain what are the priorities to be focused on when we're looking at policies on every side of the parties that are vying for our votes. Cost of living, everyone's saying that's the biggest priority. I'm not sure whether it actually is the most important priority, because if freedoms might be even more important than anything. How do you ascertain how you might prioritise the sorts of policies that you might be looking for in the people that you're going to vote for in the upcoming election?
Yeah, these questions are important questions, Neil, always, I think, and more so during an election campaign. As I said earlier, all politics and government is a project of drawing lines around freedom. And so all political parties out there have different proposals of how they plan to draw lines around freedom so as to optimise for the flourishing and well-being of Australia and Australians. So every political party platform is really a blueprint of how they plan to curtail different freedoms for our broader good. So just acknowledging that is the case, I think, is a mature and sensible way to begin. There's no one out there saying we're optimizing for all freedoms under all circumstances, right? That's anarchy. So the very fact that we live in a democracy and we have government, and thankfully in Australia we've had over many, many years governments that have broadly respected the most fundamental and basic freedoms that we hold dear and that all people everywhere deserve, regardless of their belief, I think is something we should be grateful for. So there is that. Now, when it comes to then how do we vote, there are always going to be what I consider issues of second principle. And that's about things like the cost of living, and taxation and, health and education and infrastructure and energy security and all of these sorts of things. Those are really, really important. And they're the issues that about 90 to 99% of political campaigns generally take up, if not 100%. There are also first principle issues that you hear much less about. And those are the fundamentals, if you like, the first principles of being a person, not the first principles of being a country. And those are, the freedoms of religion, the freedoms of thought and speech and conscience, the freedom of association. These are the very base level, basic freedoms that, we are all born with. And the Christian view, of course, says the reason for that is that we're all made with intrinsic dignity and intrinsic value in God's image and so forth. Now, all voters should have an eye on those first principles, even as second principles kind of dominate the field, if you like. And people will disagree on which parties are, more likely to uphold those first principles and which parties are more likely to be a risk to those first principles. And even Christians will agree, because this message of Jesus is not at first instance a political message. It doesn't map onto the left or the right. It's what I call epi-political. Epi is a little Greek prefix that means beyond or outside of or above. And so because of that, you should find thoughtful, prayerful, faithful Christians on both sides of politics. That's certainly what I find. And you'll find people disagreeing on which parties are better for the country and which parties are better for the second or the first principles. And so I think people have to make their own decisions. We have to vote based on conscience. And across all of that, we need to be respectful and gracious to those who disagree with us, regardless of whether they share our faith or they don't. There are always going to be a diversity of political views, and the idea that you could reduce and twist and squish and distill the message of Jesus down to one political party or one part of the political spectrum is hugely offensive to the gospel and hugely wrong-headed in a political context as well.
Well, as you're becoming equipped to be able to hold your own in a discussion around what's happening in the nation, I tell you, it sounds to me like there's some great content in this book we're talking about, and our special guest this hour has been Max Jeganathan. His book is called The Freedom Trap, and it's got real relationship to all of the sorts of things that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Good equipping and good focus too when it comes to how we understand freedom in light of God's Word. For listeners to be able to connect with Max, you can do so at the publicchristianity.org website. Max writes extensively now as a senior research fellow at the Centre for Public Christianity, and his new book is called The Freedom Trap. He's exploring ways to free ourselves from those traps that he was talking about. He mentioned 4 of them: choice, technology, measures of success, and consequences of our choices. You'll be able to get a hold of that book. No doubt you'll find a link on the publicchristianity.org website, and you'll be able to just Google The Freedom Trap, and you'll find online booksellers where you can get a hold of Max's new book. Max Jeganathan, Jeganathan. If you're Googling Max, you'll find out some detail about him. But Max, I want to thank you so much for taking some time to share your insights with listeners today on 2020.
Thanks so much, Neil. Great to have been with you.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.